Okay, hey everybody, thanks for joining us tonight for Lucie Levine. Women's Equality Day in the Village. At the Vanguard, the pioneering village women who fought for the vote and those who continued the fight for social and political justice. My name is Sam Moskowitz, Village Preservation's Director of Operations, and in honor of Women's Equality Day, I'm filling in for the amazing Ariel Cates, who is off tonight. Village Preservation has been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development. We conduct roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual, and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We're a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. Learn more at our new website, villagepreservation.org, and please become a member or make a donation with the link we'll be sending you in the chat, or at villagepreservation.org/donate. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us throughout the talk. I'll be here, even though I'm not visible. And use the Q&A function to submit questions, which we'll get to at the end of the lecture. And so now I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Lucie Levine is a writer, historian, and New York City tour guide. She founded Archive on Parade, a historical tour and event company that takes New York's fascinating history out of the archives and into the streets. She has collaborated with institutions, including the Municipal Art Society, Historic Districts Council, New York Public Library, 92nd Street Y, St. Regis Hotel, Landmarks West, and many more to offer exciting tours, lectures, and community events all over New York. She is also the contributing history writer at 6 Square Feet and news editor at Greenpointers. Welcome, Lucie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be with you this evening. Happy Women's Equality Day. We are celebrating the centennial of the certification of the 19th Amendment tonight, and we're also celebrating centuries of extraordinary women's activism in Greenwich Village, which touched literally every area of American life. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to give this talk. I'm so excited to speak about these women and this history because, of course, we are still in the throes of that fight. And so it gives me a lot of courage and a lot of hope to look back at this history and to look forward as we keep marching on. All right. So because this is a season of both marches and elections, it's moving to note that New York City's first women's suffrage parade was held in Greenwich Village. You can actually see a photo of it on this slide. That's 1912. The first march on Washington in American history was also led by a village woman, and the first woman to run for president was a villager. But our story starts before any of that. Our story starts with an 18th century Black woman. Without Black people, there would be no Greenwich Village. The first free Black settlement in North America was established in what's now Greenwich Village and parts of the Lower East Side and the East Village between 1643 and 1662. When the British took New Amsterdam in 1664, they stripped free Black people of the property they owned in what is now the village. You can see the plots here. And thus seized their land holdings. But Black people continued to build community in Greenwich Village, and from the 19th century through the very early part of the 20th century, Greenwich Village was home to New York's largest Black community. A pillar of that community was Catherine Ferguson. She was an educator and abolitionist, and the first pioneer that we'll talk about this evening. She was born into slavery in 1774 or 1779 and died at her home at 74 Thompson Street here in the South Village in July of 1854. Ferguson is credited with founding what is considered to be New York City's first Sunday school further downtown at 51 Warren Street in 1793. Her Sunday school was integrated. She provided care and instruction to 48 children, 20 of whom were white, 28 of whom were Black. Now, today, we can't see Ferguson's home because 74 Thompson Street is occupied by a tenement that was built in 1910. But when we think about history, we think about change and continuity through time. That's what the study of history is. And while we see change, we can also see an incredible amount of continuity when we speak about women's history and activism. Because about a week after Ferguson died, that same July of 1854, Elizabeth Jennings Graham, a 24-year-old African-American school teacher who was on her way to the First Colored Congregational Church at 228 East 6th Street, where she played the organ, became what is now considered America's first freedom rider. She refused to give up her seat on a streetcar 99 years before Rosa Parks made that same brave choice. Now, for Jennings, that was extremely dangerous. At the time, New York City streetcar drivers carried whips with them to keep Black people off of streetcars. Jennings was forcibly removed from the 3rd Avenue Railway streetcar downtown at Pearl and Catham Streets. Catham Street at this time is now Park Row. She was injured by the driver and a policeman. The next day, a rally was held at the First Colored Congregational, where a letter that Jennings had written was read aloud about her experience. That experience was also publicized by Frederick Douglass. Now, Elizabeth's father, Thomas L. Jennings, was an abolitionist and one of the nation's first Black patent holders. He hired the very young Chester A. Arthur to represent Elizabeth in court. She won that legal battle and was awarded $247.50 in damages from the 3rd Avenue Railroad Company, which also desegregated its services. The rest of the New York City transit system was desegregated in 1865. Today, the church that she was on her way to, First Colored Congregational, no longer stands at 228 East 6th Street, but we can see the building that's there now. I begin this lecture with Catherine Ferguson and Elizabeth Jennings Graham, not only because they are some of the village's earliest equal justice pioneers, but also because they were Black activists and abolitionists. And the American women's suffrage movement comes directly out of the abolitionist movement. In fact, in the years before the Civil War, the idea of women's equality and equal suffrage was considered, after emancipation, to be, quote, a new outlet in the cause of justice. Now, the fact that Ferguson and Graham were also both educators and connected to the church helps illustrate that educational and spiritual institutions in the village and throughout the country would be an early cradle and backbone in the fight for so many types of equality. Now, one spiritual institution was Mother Zion AME Church at 215 West 10th Street, which was known as the Freedom Church because of its role in the Underground Railroad. The abolitionist suffragists Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass all worshipped there. Now, as for educational institutions, there were two that were founded in Greenwich Village in the 1850s that were intimately connected to women's equality. The first was Elizabeth Blackwell's New York Infirmary for Women and Children in 1857, and the second was Cooper Union in 1859. Now, Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States when she graduated from the Geneva Medical College, which is now Hobart College, in 1849. In 1851, she moved to the building that is now 80 University Place. At the time, it was numbered 44 University Place. She used the building as a home and medical office, seeing to mostly female patients. In 1853, she moved her practice to 207 East 7th Street, establishing the New York Dispensary for poor women and children there, so that women without means could consult a female doctor. In 1857, she established the New York Infirmary for Women and Children at 58 Bleaker Street. It opened May 12, 1857, on her friend Florence Nightingale's 37th birthday. It was the first hospital in the United States for women, staffed by women, and run by women. It provided free medical care for women and provided medical instruction for women studying for their medical degrees. The hospital also launched a sanitary visitor program where women doctors, including Rebecca Cole, the second Black woman to become a doctor in the United States, were able to visit patients in their homes. This is an innovation that became even more widespread in New York City when Lillian Wald founded the Visiting Nurse Service of New York in the 1890s. Now, Elizabeth Blackwell went on to form the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary, also in the Village at 126 2nd Avenue, in 1868. It was the first female medical school in the United States, and it ultimately trained 350 women physicians. But before that, Cooper Union opened in 1859. Now, the impact of Cooper Union on progress, reform, and social justice in American life cannot be overstated. In fact, we'll come back to Cooper Union over and over again throughout this lecture. Cooper Union opened, as I said, in 1859 as the People's Institute, dedicated to whatsoever things are true. It was formed by this extraordinary man, this is Peter Cooper, who was an industrialist who endowed the school to educate working class New Yorkers at no cost to them. He believed that the finest technical education should be open and free to all, regardless of race, religion, class, or sex. Because education, he believed, was not only a route to personal prosperity, but also to civic virtue and harmony. Cooper believed that one path to a robust civil society was an open forum for debate. So he established public lectures in the basement of the Great Hall, which seats 900 people. In this case, you can see Abraham Lincoln speaking in the Great Hall. When the Great Hall opened, it was actually the largest secular meeting room in the city of New York. It was so big because Cooper wanted to teach as many students as possible and as many New Yorkers as possible about the skills of debate and democratic leadership, because he believed in democracy in the broadest sense. Now, accordingly, he was an abolitionist, he was an advocate for Native American rights, and he was a strong supporter of women's rights. That brings us to the 10th National Women's Rights Convention held at Cooper Union, May 10th and 11th, 1860. Now, the convention was attended between 600 and 800 people. In her speech at that convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton asked, "Can a woman be said to have a right to life if all means of self-protection are denied to her? Can she be said to have a right to liberty when another citizen may have the legal custody of her person? Can any citizen be said to have the right to the pursuit of happiness whose inalienable rights are denied, who is disenfranchised from the privilege of citizenship?" Now, those words ring as true today as they did then. Stanton and other activists at that convention at Cooper Union in 1860 also called for a resolution that would push for marriage reform legislation in the United States, which would give women the right to a separation or divorce on the grounds of drunkenness, insanity, desertion, or cruelty. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, of course, is a very well-known suffragist, but she was certainly not the only person leading this convention. Another woman was somebody, one of so many women in history, called dangerous, named Martha Coffin Wright, the sister of the perhaps better known Lucretia Mott. Wright presided over this convention. She was the president of this 10th convention in 1860. Her home in Auburn, New York, was a station on the Underground Railroad. So was her vice president of this convention, and that's Abby Hopper Gibbons, whose home on what is now West 29th Street was also a station on the Underground Railroad. Now, I mention this because Gibbons, while being vice president of this particular convention, was also a lifelong leader at another village institution called the Women's Prison Association. In fact, she was instrumental in securing the home of that organization here at 110 2nd Avenue in 1874, where it remains to this day and still advocates for prison reform. It's actually one of the oldest women's institutions in the nation. Now, I know that I have just mentioned this as another institution, but actually we can't really leave Cooper Union just yet, because our nation descends into civil war on April 12th, 1861. And what happens? Well, Elizabeth Blackwell and her sister Emily, who was also a physician, immediately outlined a plan to meet the medical needs of Union soldiers by organizing war relief and by supervising a corps of female nurses to work in military hospitals. Exactly 2 weeks after the war began, they hold this meeting, where you can see the engraving here, at Cooper Union. Nearly 4,000 people gathered both inside the hall and outside the Union to found the Women's Central Relief Association of New York on April 26, 1861. By May 15th of that year, the WCRA became the United States Sanitary Commission. The United States Sanitary Commission was the precursor to the American Red Cross, and in a war where more soldiers actually died of disease than of battle wounds, it became the largest national public health effort in American history up to that time. Now, women were indispensable as field nurses during the war, which you can see here. But one village woman and suffrage pioneer in particular played an unusual and deeply interesting role. And that woman is Julia Ward Howe. Julia Ward Howe lived at the corner of Broadway and Bond Streets in her brother's mansion, actually, from 1833 to 1839. And in 1861, when she was visiting Union troops with her husband in Washington, D.C., she wrote the pro-Union Army abolitionist song, The Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, Howe went on to become the co-leader of the American Women's Suffrage Association, which we will speak about later in this lecture. She also founded the Women's Journal. She was founder and president of the Association of American Women, and ultimately the first woman to be elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. But the Battle Hymn of the Republic as a song, as an anthem, stands out for a reason. It's not only because it was a Civil War anthem, but also because it became an anthem of the Civil Rights Movement. In fact, Martin Luther King ended his last speech given the day before he was assassinated. He gave that speech April 3rd, 1968, and he ended it with the words, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," which is, of course, a lyric in that song. Now, the reason I bring that up is because it helps express why so many of the earliest abolitionists and women's rights pioneers, as well as social justice advocates throughout the years, were members of the clergy or have been deeply faithful. It's because when we're talking about equality, we're talking about the equality of the soul, that all people are equal in the eyes of God. And when we talk about the truth is marching on, that kind of equality is in fact the truth that goes marching wherever people are marching for justice. Now, that also helps explain why the first national women's suffrage organization in this nation was not only concerned with women, and why also it was created at a church. Now, this was the American Equal Rights Association. That organization was founded at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention, held May 10th, 1866, here in the Village, at the Church of the Puritans on Union Square. The American Equal Rights Association was founded to, quote, secure the equal rights of all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. It was created by suffragists and abolitionists, including Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who you can see here. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper later helped found the National Association of Colored Women. But at this particular founding, at this particular meeting at the Church of the Puritans to found the American Equal Rights Association, she gave one of her most famous speeches. She said, "You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in the situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man, and every man's hand against me." Those wrongs which she articulated in 1866, and which we feel so acutely today, actually tore the suffrage movement apart 3 years later, in 1869. That year, the American Equal Rights Association actually broke into factions over the 15th Amendment, because the 15th Amendment nominally granted the vote to Black men, but not to women. Of course, most Black people would not be able to vote in the United States of America until 1965, the Voting Rights Act. But this was a watershed situation. Now, the American Women's Suffrage Association, the American Equal Rights Association broke up over this issue, which was the granting of suffrage to Black men, but not to women. And so what happens is that we have now two organizations. We have the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and which had all female leadership, and which was opposed to the 15th Amendment because it did not enfranchise women, and was singularly focused on enfranchising women. And then, as a converse, you had the American Women's Suffrage Association. So just to make that clear, we have the National Women's Suffrage Association, and we have the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by both men and women and supported the 15th Amendment. Now, the American Women's Suffrage Association leaders included Julia Ward Howe, who we've already spoken about, the abolitionist and suffragist who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Lucy Stone, this is Lucy Stone, who, funnily enough, her husband was actually Henry Blackwell, who was Elizabeth Blackwell's brother. So you can see the sort of very close association between activists within this 19th century cohort. Not only that, also Henry Ward Beecher, the abolitionist preacher at Brooklyn's Plymouth Church, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whom we just spoke about, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Josephine Ruffin, who also founded the nation's very first Black women's newspaper called the Women's Era. So that's 1869 that we have this schism between supporters of the 15th Amendment and supporters of a totally separate amendment that would only enfranchise women. In fact, Susan B. Anthony was quoted as saying at that time that she would rather cut off her right arm than fight for the right of suffrage for a Black man before a woman. And this was a damning cry to make because she had been so deeply a part of the abolitionist movement. And in fact, she gave the eulogy for Frederick Douglass. And so it was a very divisive statement, and was so at the time, and really rended into the suffrage movement. But speaking of equal rights, now it is 1870. And 1870 is the year that the 15th Amendment is actually ratified, and that this person, Victoria Woodhull, announces her candidacy for president. Victoria Woodhull was a villager. She lived at 17 Great Jones Street. I can't show you anything that stands there now because 17 Great Jones Street was demolished when Lafayette Street was extended at the turn of the 20th century. Woodhull was the first woman to run for president in the United States. She ran in the 1872 election. She was both a suffragist and a free love advocate, which meant something very different to her than perhaps it meant in the 1960s. She meant by free love the freedom to marry, divorce, and bear children without government interference. She and her sister, Tennessee Claflin, became the first women to found a stock brokerage firm on Wall Street. Together, they also founded a newspaper called Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, which began publishing in 1870. Now, she used this paper for a variety of things: to advocate her candidacy, to advocate women's suffrage, to advocate free love as she understood it, and also to call out the double standard in free love between men and women. Specifically, she outed Henry Ward Beecher's affair with his parishioner, Elizabeth Tilden. And because she did that, what happens? Well, Henry Ward Beecher becomes one of the most famous men in America because there was a scandalous trial. And Victoria Woodhull herself is actually arrested for obscenity. And so that lands her in jail during the election for which she is running for president. Now, Victoria Woodhull was nominated by the Equal Rights Party in May of 1872. And the party at that nominating convention also nominated Frederick Douglass as her vice president. But Douglass did not acknowledge the nomination. Now, at the time of her nomination, Victoria Woodhull declared, "From this convention will go forth a tide of revolution." Now, I'm sorry to tell you that Victoria Woodhull did not become president. And for that, as today, we can blame the Electoral College, right? She did not get any electoral votes. But the tide of revolution did continue to flow. And when we speak about equal rights, the year 1880 finds Sarah Smith Garnett, who founded the Equal Suffrage League of Brooklyn, which was the first suffrage organization in the country founded by and for Black women, living at 175 McDougal Street here in Greenwich Village with her husband, Henry Highland Garnett, who was actually a militant abolitionist preacher and the first Black man to address the United States Congress. Later, he would become the US Minister to Liberia. Now, Sarah Smith Garnett was an extraordinary trailblazer. So was her sister, Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who was the first female physician in New York State. Now, Sarah herself was a first. Beyond even founding the first Black women's suffrage association in the nation, she also was the first Black female principal within the New York City public school system. Now, both of these women, both Sarah Smith Garnett and her sister, Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, were born into a family of pioneers. They were born in Brooklyn, in Weeksville, which was the second largest free Black community in antebellum America. They were the daughters of Sylvana Smith, who was one of the founders of Weeksville. And Weeksville was self-consciously involved with the vote in that at the time when it was founded in the 1830s, laws on the books in New York State called for Black voters, Black men as voters, to own $250 worth of property. White men were not required to hold property at the time. And so the men who founded Weeksville bought property for a number of reasons, but suffrage was one of them, because they understood that to have the vote was to have something closer to full citizenship. And so that was something that both Sarah Smith Garnett and her sister, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, were brought up understanding and brought up fighting for. Now, both Susan and Sarah would go on to help found even more suffrage organizations. The Garnett sisters together in 1892 worked with a group of African American women to create the Women's Loyal Union of New York and Brooklyn. And because of her service to suffrage, Sarah Smith Garnett was actually elected superintendent of the suffrage department of the National Organization of Colored Women. Now, this work on suffrage in the 1890s was part of a proliferation of suffrage organizations that were opening then. And in Greenwich Village in particular, the 1890s were overwhelmingly fecund in terms of social justice movements. Why? Well, on a national level, in 1890, we have a union of those two suffrage organizations I was talking about. Remember, I mentioned the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Well, in 1890, they come together as one, and funnily, or perhaps predictably enough, when those two organizations come together, they simply merge their name. And so instead of the National American instead of the National Women's Suffrage Association or the American Women's Suffrage Association, we get quite literally the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So that's our national backdrop of this new sort of turning of the tide in the suffrage movement. But in Greenwich Village in particular, in 1890, we have something quite phenomenal. And if you have listened to me give talks before with village preservation, then you know that I always talk about this. This is one of my most sort of closely held things that I love to talk about because it fascinates me so deeply, which is the opening of New York University Law School to women. In 1890, NYU establishes the Women's Law Class, which was the first of its kind in the nation. That year, the socialite Fanny Weber and her friend Emily Keppen, who had earned a law degree at the University of Zurich, tried to operate a legal dispensary for the poor, but so many women arrived for legal advice they could not handle the demand. So Fanny Weber begins to negotiate with NYU, and the university agrees to sponsor a women's law class with Keppen as lecturer. Now, the law class is a certificate program, but less than a year later, NYU votes unanimously to admit women into the law class itself, and degree candidates begin to earn LLBs. In 1893. So the NYU law class of 1893 is the first in which women are graduating alongside men. There are 3 women in that class. So those women went through the women's law class first for a year and then matriculated at the law school proper and graduated alongside men in 1893. Now, just to put that in perspective, how radical and extraordinary this was, Columbia did not admit women to its law school until 1941, and Harvard Law did not admit women until 1950. Now, one of the first female graduates of NYU, a member of that first women's law class in 1890, and then one of the 3 women who graduated from the law school proper in 1893 was Cornelia K. Hood. She was valedictorian of that first women's law class. And in her valedictory address entitled, "Why I Study Law," she said, "The laws of the land do not protect the natural rights of women sufficiently, nor do they seek to place her on a mental or moral equivalent with man. Women must bring about this elevation, which they sorely need. To do this, they must organize, and legal advisors among themselves will be indispensable." Now, Cornelia K. Hood went on to become one of the most beloved legal advisors in New York. So she graduates in 1893. And she actually lived in Brooklyn. She lived at 64 Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights. And at the time, you can actually see from this PowerPoint that her name is listed here in the bulletin of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. Today, that's the Brooklyn Museum, but at the time, it was an independent institution in Brooklyn Heights. And so at that organization, she began in 1894 her Women's Law Lecture series, in which she began for free to discuss issues that were of particular importance to women. So these would be issues like custody of children, or contracts, or how to open a bank account, because again, women were deeply disenfranchised by the law at this time in the United States of America. And so she understood that if she had gained this knowledge for herself, it was something that she could help share with other women. And this became so important that what you see here is the Cornelia K. Hood Law Endowment, which was a memorial fund. After she died, members of the Brooklyn Women's Suffrage Association, members of the Brooklyn Women's Club, members of a variety of other suffrage organizations throughout New York and throughout the nation donated money so that this could continue even after her death, because her work was so important. So she begins those lectures in 1894. That same year, she became the founding president of the Kings County Political Equality League because she lived in Brooklyn. But by 1895, a year later, she's actually treasurer of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. Now, you might be thinking, why don't I have a picture of her? I've never been able to find one, even though she was such an extraordinary woman and she was so adept at sharing her knowledge and helping other people and was so beloved within her community and within this city. There's actually no pictorial record of her that I've been able to find, which is stunning to me. The same is true for her classmate in the NYU Law Class of 1893, a woman named Kate Hogan. Now, Kate Hogan founded the New York City Women Teachers Association, and she was the founder of a precedent-setting campaign against sex discrimination in salaries. In 1906, she sent the slogan, "Equal pay for equal work," thundering around the world. Now, these graduates of 1893 are certainly not the only ones who were extraordinary in their tenacity, in their spirit, in their work for women's equality. There were so many women who were graduating from NYU Law and whose work began in the village, many of whom lived here, and whose work permeated American life from the work they were doing in the village. So one of those women was Jessie Ashley, NYU Law Class of 1902, who was a founder of the National Birth Control League and an organizer for the IWW. She also was the national treasurer for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. That same year, also the class of 1902, we have Ida Rowe, who lived a couple of places in Greenwich Village, both at 15 East 11th Street and 39.5 Washington Square, who chaired the legislative committee of the Women's Trade Union League. You can actually see her, that photograph of her on the left. She's on the picket line for the uprising of 20,000 in 1909, which I'm going to tell you more about very, very shortly. But you can actually see her in terms of her trade union work. Not only that, she helped found the Provincetown Playhouse, and she was jailed along with Jessie Ashley in 1916 for flouting the Comstock laws, which were anti-obscenity laws, by distributing birth control literature in Union Square. Jessie Ashley and Ida Rowe, though, were not the only members of the class of 1902 to make an incredible impact. There was also Madeline Z. Dottie, who was named New York State's first woman prison commissioner in 1912 and went undercover to investigate prison conditions. She was named New York State's delegate to the Women's Peace Conference, and she was a traveling correspondent for the New York Times in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. She was also on the Russell Sage Foundation's Women's Court Committee. Now, she also served as International Secretary for the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. While abroad, she received a PhD in International Relations from the University of Geneva and later taught there speaking of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, that particular league was actually founded by another graduate of NYU Law School, who is one of my personal favorite human beings of all time, and that is Crystal Eastman, class of 1907. She graduated second in her class from NYU Law School. She was the first female commissioner in New York State. She was appointed to the Unemployment Commission. She wrote the report for that commission known as Work Accidents and the Law, which led to the very first workers' compensation legislation in the United States, which she herself wrote in 1910. She was also a founding member of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in 1912, which we're going to talk about more, and a co-founder of the ACLU with Roger Baldwin, which was originally founded to aid conscientious objectors against the First World War. She said, there must be something worth coming back to once this weary war is over. And she also founded the Women's Peace Party. Not only that, with her brother Max Eastman, they founded The Liberator, a revolutionary journal of progress, which was devoted to politics, arts, and letters. This was a follow-up journal to the Masses magazine, which Max himself had been editor of from 1912 to 1917. This they founded together in 1917 after the Masses was defunct over the Espionage Act in 1917. It was impossible to get it sent through the mail, so it folded. But Eastman was a writer for The Liberator, and we're going to speak more about her writing later in this lecture. I'm going to quote her pretty much at length over her platform for women's rights, because her writing remains to this day some of what I consider the clearest writing on an extraordinary women's rights platform. But before we do that, I also want to tell you that she was one of the 4 original writers of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was originally introduced in 1923. But around this time, it's important to note that there were also men in the fight for women's suffrage, one of whom was Max Eastman, her brother, who founded here in Greenwich Village the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in 1909. Now, many of these women who had been graduates of NYU Law, who were living and working in Greenwich Village, wanted and needed to support themselves, each other, and other women in the neighborhood. So they came together in a variety of organizations. One of the most interesting is Heterodoxy Club, which met on Saturdays at 137 McDougal Street, which was home to Polly's Restaurant, which you can see here. This is a photograph taken by Jessie Tarbox Beals, who was actually the first published female photojournalist in the United States. Polly's Restaurant refers to its proprietor, Polly Holliday, who was an anarchist who came from Evanston, Illinois, and who served, among other things, basically fine spaghetti. Not great spaghetti, but edible spaghetti. What people came for was not the food, but for the conversation. And the conversation at Heterodoxy was pretty remarkable in the sense that it was founded by and for women who understood themselves to be, quote, unorthodox, who did things and did them openly. One of the founding women of Heterodoxy was Marie Jenny Howe, who said that through the women's movement, women could be, quote, their whole big human selves. And several Heterodoxy members were also lesbian and queer pioneers, like this woman, Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker. She calls herself Dr. Joe after Joe March. Dr. Baker revolutionized preventive medicine in New York City and in the nation as an assistant health commissioner for the city of New York. She instituted a citywide baby care program in the summer of 1908. Her division of child hygiene for the New York City Health Department was the first such bureau in the United States. It was a model for the United States Children's Bureau, established 1912. Baker went on in 1909 to found the American Child Hygiene Association and served as president of that organization in 1917. 1917 was a pretty big year for her. That year, she became the first woman to earn a doctorate in public health from the New York University and Bellevue Hospital Medical College, now known as New York University School of Medicine. From 1922 to 1924, she served as a member of the Health Committee of the League of Nations and as a consultant on child hygiene to the New York State Department of Health and the U.S. Department of Labor, as well as the U.S. Public Health Services. With the Division of Child Hygiene, Baker assigned 83 nurses to visit mothers of newborn babies and instruct those mothers as to the feeding, bathing, clothing, airing, and general care of the infant. In doing this, she helped invent the concept of preventive medicine, which was not to teach people how to recover from being sick, but how to stay well, which is something that is deeply meaningful for us at this moment. Now, she was extremely successful in what she did. Between 1908 and 1914, the rate of death for children under 1 year in New York City dropped by 40%. In fact, by the time she retired in 1923, New York had the lowest rate of infant mortality of any major American city. Now, there were other pioneers in heterodoxy, one of whom was its only Black member, Grace Nile Johnson, the wife of James Wendell Johnson. Grace Nile Johnson was a writer, an activist, and an arts patron of the Harlem Renaissance. Her husband, seen here, was James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is now considered the Black national anthem. He was also the first Black man to be elected executive secretary of the NAACP, a position that he took in 1920. Now, the NAACP actually had its very first public meeting at Cooper Union in the summer of 1909. This flag, a symbol of the NAACP, and a call to arms, flew from the NAACP headquarters here in the Village at 69 Fifth Avenue. The original headquarters was across the street at 70 Fifth Avenue. This photo, though, was taken in the 1920s when it had moved. Now, as I mentioned, the NAACP is founded at Cooper Union in 1909, and that is not the only major convention that convenes at Cooper Union that year. 1909 is a very big year for Greenwich Village. 1909 is also the year of the uprising of 20,000. So Cooper Union is strike headquarters. The uprising of 20,000 was the largest women's strike in American history. Up to that time, it was a shirtwaist strike of garment workers, 20,000 women walked off their jobs in 2 days. This photo of strike headquarters was taken November 22nd, 1909. We can see the women on the picket line. These are sister strikers. The person who called strike was this woman, the 23-year-old Clara Lemlich, called strike from stage at Cooper Union and was a villager herself. She lived at 278 East 3rd Street, although at the time that would have been more likely considered the Lower East Side than Greenwich Village, but those were permeable barriers. This was not, you know, like a divided neighborhood in that way. Now, there were many strike leaders. Clara Lemlich was not alone. As you can see, none of these women are alone. There are hundreds of women in the audience here. But one of the most remarkable was this woman, Rose Schneiderman, a Polish Jewish immigrant who came to New York City in 1890. She lived at 57 to 59 2nd Avenue and helped lay the groundwork for that strike as both a labor leader. At the time, she was the vice president of the New York branch of the Women's Trade Union League, and she would become president of the national organization in 1926, and also as a leader in the women's suffrage movement. She was a leader in the Equality League for Self-Supporting Women and a featured speaker for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Schneiderman's labor politics and suffrage politics were always connected. In her most famous speech, she said, "What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The right to life and sun and music and art. A worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Help, you women of privilege. Give her the ballot to fight with." Bread and roses is an enduring mark of the labor movement, this idea that workers and working women in particular need bread and also need roses, that without beauty, life would be unbearable. That was also the stance of Emma Goldman, which is that things like flowers or music or joy were indispensable, because without them, what life were you living? So this is the point that Rose Schneiderman makes. And she says, give her the ballot to fight with, that to make oneself an enriched life, a life in which somebody is living with roses, they need first practical means to get there. The ballot is one. Now, because these two ideas are so connected, this idea of labor reform and of women's suffrage, Rose Schneiderman becomes a force in national labor politics. She actually was the only woman that Franklin Roosevelt appointed on the National Recovery Administration's Labor Advisory Board. Now, speaking of labor in the FDR administration, 1909 not only brings us the shirtwaist strike, it also brings the great and glorious Frances Perkins to Greenwich Village. Now, Frances Perkins was the nation's first female cabinet secretary and the longest serving Secretary of Labor in United States history. She served the entirety of the FDR administration from 1933 to 1945. She was the principal architect of the New Deal. There was an article in Life magazine which declared, "The New Deal is often called the Roosevelt New Deal. It should properly be called the Perkins New Deal." And indeed, it was her brainchild. She instituted the CCC and the WPA. She established unemployment benefits, minimum wage, and overtime pay. She standardized the 40-hour work week. And before all that, she moved to Greenwich Village in 1909, while she was getting a master's in political science from Columbia, which she earned in 1910. In 1911, she was an eyewitness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Before we get there, when she moved to Greenwich Village, she moved to Greenwich House at 27 Barrow Street. Greenwich House being a settlement house. Her goal when she moved to Greenwich Village was to become involved in the settlement movement. She had a variety of apartments throughout Greenwich Village, and so she was living in the neighborhood on the day of the fire, which was March 25th, 1911, and she saw it from the sidewalk. And it was such a moving moment that she calls March 25th, 1911, the day of the fire, the day that the New Deal began. Now, the Triangle Fire was a bellwether in the American labor movement and also in the women's movement. It was the deadliest workplace tragedy in the United States of America prior to 9/11. 146 people, mostly women and girls, who were immigrant toilers in this particular factory and of Jewish and Italian heritage, were killed by negligence and greed. Now, the owners of this building, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, were charged with manslaughter because they had locked the doors and kept those women trapped inside. But in a verdict that feels jarringly familiar, they were acquitted in less than 2 hours. Perkins called it the fire that lit the nation because it galvanized not only the labor movement, but also the women's movement. And indeed, the women's movement really does begin to burn anew in 1912, because we have the creation of a new, much more militant organization, which is the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which in 1916 will become the National Women's Party. Now, as I said, Crystal Eastman, whom we spoke about, was a founder of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, but this organization is most closely associated with 2 other women. They are Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. The photo I show here of Lucy Burns is her in jail in 1917, because she actually has the designation of the suffragist who was jailed the most time for her suffrage activities. She actually met Alice Paul while in jail in England. Lucy Burns is a really interesting figure. She was born and raised in Brooklyn. She was born in Park Slope. She attended Packer Collegiate in Brooklyn Heights, and she herself became a teacher in Brooklyn. She taught at Erasmus Hall, which is the oldest secondary school in Brooklyn. Now, she decides after a period of teaching that she wants to learn more herself. So she goes to England to study at Oxford. And while she's there, she becomes involved with Emmeline Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union, which is a much more militant organization than what is passing for suffrage and women's rights advocacy in the United States. In the United States, the National American Women's Suffrage Association is doing its best to be considered respectable, right? We've got suffrage white, everybody is advocating, but not with the militancy that's seen in England. In England, women are chaining themselves, to the Houses of Parliament. There are hunger strikes. There are women who are being disruptive in a way that their American counterparts are not. In fact, Lucy Burns herself, while in England, will charge into a club on Pall Mall and interrupt Winston Churchill while he's eating, and she says to him, Winston Churchill, how can you eat while women are in jail? Of course, she's jailed for that. And when she's in jail, she meets Alice Paul, who was also in England at the time. And they're able to recognize each other because they're both wearing American flag pins on their lapels, which I think is so funny, because now, of course, that's a very conservative move, right? But at the time, it was a way for these two women to identify themselves to one another. So they meet and they return to the United States in 1912 to bring this militancy that they learned in England to their home country. So when they do that, they create this new organization. And that organization will begin to create suffrage schools under the auspices of Lucy Burns herself, which start to teach other women how to sort of tap into that militancy that they learned in England. So this is what's going on the national stage. The Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage has its national headquarters in Washington. It is advocating in that as a nationwide organization with chapters throughout the nation. But in Greenwich Village itself, 1912 is a major, major year, even beyond this. Why? Well, in 1912, Greenwich Village actually becomes the site of the first women's suffrage parade in New York City, and it is led by this extraordinary woman, Mabel Pinghua Lee. She was 16 years old at the time, and actually a student at Erasmus Hall, where Lucy Burns herself had once been a teacher. So this was quite an amazing march. It drew upwards of 10,000 people, originating, as you can see here, at Washington Square, and proceeding up Fifth Avenue to 27th Street near Madison Square Park. Of those 10,000 people, one is Lee, who helps lead the march itself on horseback. You can see her here. After this march, also in 1912, Lee begins attending Barnard, still at the age of 16, where she wrote and lectured about the meaning of women's suffrage and equality of opportunity. This was particularly acute for Lee because the Chinese Exclusion Act barred Chinese people from becoming American citizens or voting at all until 1943. There is not a record of whether Lee herself ever became a citizen or voted in the United States, but we know that she absolutely became the first Chinese woman to earn a PhD in economics from Columbia, and that she went on to found the Chinese Christian Center, a community center here in New York City. In fact, she devoted her life to New York's Chinese community. Wonderfully enough, Mabel Lee, when she was profiled in the Times for this incredible outpouring of suffrage zeal in Greenwich Village, which she herself is leading, the New York Times calls her a symbol of a new era. And in fact, Greenwich Village itself actually does enter a new era in 1912. 1912 marks the beginning of the village's lyric period. It's named the lyric period. It got this name later. This is a historical moniker, if you like. It got the name lyric period beginning in 1912, which describes the years in the village between 1912 and 1917, when the United States enters the First World War. And it's used to describe the spirit of Bohemia and sort of radical intelligentsia that's going on in the village at this time. And the reason that I have a photo of Edna St. Vincent Millay here is because it's actually a reference to her. Emma St. Vincent Millay published that year in 1912 her landmark poem Renaissance, which she wrote when she was 19. It was published in the lyric year, and so the lyric period. Now, interestingly enough, Millay herself was a suffragist. She had been to Vassar, which was a cradle of the suffrage movement itself. And she wrote a poem to another Vassar grad, Inez Mulholland, which she read in Washington, November 18th, 1923, at the unveiling of a suffrage memorial, which did not include Inez Mulholland. But there's also something that connects Inez Mulholland. I'm going to tell you a lot about Inez Mulholland, but I have to tell you this first. That Emma St. Vincent Millay is standing in this photograph next to her husband, Eugene Boissevain, who was also Inez Mulholland's husband. Inez Mulholland married him first. She becomes a martyr of the suffrage movement. She dies at the age of 30, and then he goes on to marry Emma St. Vincent Millay. And so Emma St. Vincent Millay memorializes her dear friend and comrade in the suffrage movement, Inez Mulholland. And she writes, "Upon this marble bust that is not I, lay the round formal wreath that is not fame, but in the form of my silenced cry, root ye the living tree, whose sap is flame. I that was proud and valiant am no more, save as a dream and wanders wide and late, save as a wind that rattles the stout door, trembling the ashes in the sheltered grate. The stone will perish, I shall be twice dust, only my standard on the taken hill can cheat the mildew and the red-brown rust, and make immortal my adventurous will. Even now, the sill is tugging at the staff. Take up the song, forget the epitaph." Now, this idea of taking up the song, this is Inez Mulholland, and she takes up the song in a really big way. She becomes the Joan of Arc of the women's suffrage movement in 1913. She was a villager. She lived at 9 East 9th Street. She actually was born in Brooklyn. She grew up in Brooklyn, but why was she living in Greenwich Village? That's right, you guessed it, to attend NYU Law School, which she graduated from in 1912. She becomes a labor lawyer, and she will actually represent the rebel girl, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, in court. But following this graduation in 1912, she goes on to lead, just like Mabel Pinkhua Lee was leading this suffrage parade on horseback, so did Inez Mulholland. She becomes the sort of marshal of the 1913 suffrage parade, which was the first march on Washington. It was it took place the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was such a sort of brittle foe to the women's movement. We know that he was a stone racist, that he single-handedly resegregated the nation's civil service, but also not only was he a racist, but also he was deeply opposed to women's suffrage. In fact, whenever he saw a woman speaking in public, he would physically shake. So women planned this march to coincide with his inauguration, and it's led by Inez Mulholland. And we can see what's going on here. Now, this was organized by the National Women's Party, well, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, what will become the National Women's Party, by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. And it's really important to note that Alice Paul in particular, Lucy Burns less so, but Alice Paul in particular was very much aligned with white feminism and the idea of this being a white women's movement, which is something that people talk about a lot for the early suffrage movement and the women's movement. Now, of course, we know, as we've seen in this lecture, and I certainly have not mentioned all of the extraordinary Black activists who were part of the early women's movement. I've tried to include many who were living in Greenwich Village, but of course there were Black women throughout the nation who were fighting this fight. And at this procession, Black women were asked, or told rather, that they needed to march behind white women. They could not march with their state delegations. And Ida B. Wells refused to do that, and she marched with her state delegation and would not be relegated to the back. And so when we think about just the zeal that's going on here and the extraordinary work that these women are doing, we must acknowledge that, of course, Black women had to work so much harder just to be included. Now, do I have, let's see, okay. So this idea of Inez Milholland leading this parade, so she is extremely active in the Congressional Union for women's suffrage. And when it becomes the National Women's Party in 1916, she goes on a lecture tour. And on that lecture tour, she uses the same cry that she uses at this parade. And that cry is, "Mr. Wilson, how long must women wait for liberty?" And this becomes the rallying cry of the movement. And so she ends each of her speeches with it. And those will actually be her last words. She dies in LA after giving a speech in 1916 for the National Women's Party. And she says, "How long must women wait for liberty?" And she collapses and she dies, and she becomes this martyr of the movement. And so even after her death, women will take up this cry. And so what I want to say about this, when we're thinking about the Edna St. Vincent Millay poem here, right? Take up the song, forget the epitaph. That's what people are doing. And in fact, that's actually what happened to Inez Milholland. In a lot of ways, she was forgotten in the story of women's suffrage, but that cry of "Mr. Wilson, how long must women wait for liberty?" Outlived her in a really extraordinary way. Now, when she did die, where was the memorial? Well, you guessed it, Cooper Union. And the year after this march, we have also at Cooper Union, I think one of my favorite handbills that was ever created is this: "What is feminism? Come and find out. The first feminist mass meeting at the People's Institute, Cooper Union." And we can see all of these women, right? We can see Frances Perkins is there, Crystal Eastman is there, Henrietta Rodman, who was a member of heterodoxy, is there, Rose Schneiderman, we can see, is there. Just all of these women living and working in Greenwich Village have come to ask this question and to opine as to what is feminism. Cooper Union remains really the cradle of this movement. And when New York State passes women's suffrage, I never say grants women the right to vote, because women were not granted the right to vote, they fought for it. So when they won the right to vote in 1917, on November 6th, 1917, the celebration was held at Cooper Union. But 1917 also kicked off something else. So when women won the right to vote in New York State, they certainly did not stop there. And from January 10th, 1917 to June 4th, 1919, when the 19th Amendment passed the House and the Senate, women staged the Silent Sentinels at the gates of the White House. This was organized by the National Women's Party and in particular by Lucy Burns. And it was women silently standing at the gates of the White House so that Woodrow Wilson, who so opposed suffrage, would always have to see them, would always know that they were there. And as you can see, right, we have this banner, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? So taking up the song, right? Now, 2,000 women picketed in that time between 1917 and 1919. And this was dangerous work. There was, on November 14th, 1917, at the Occoquan Workhouse in Washington, which was a women's reformatory, something known as the Night of Terror. Women who had been arrested for this picketing here and also, jarringly, in Lafayette Square, were beaten and choked by guards and by policemen, and were also force-fed. They had undertaken a hunger strike. And I mention this for a lot of reasons. This, of course, does not happen in Greenwich Village, but did very much involve a villager, Dorothy Day, who went on to found the Catholic Worker, was beaten and force-fed that night. And you can see her here. Yes, I am a radical. There are two pictures of her here, one younger, one older. They're both Dorothy Day. And so the Night of Terror, in a lot of ways, helps to galvanize the nation in the same way that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was such a bellwether because it was such a horrific situation. So was the reality, the understanding that women were going to be brutalized in this fight. And so that helped. That certainly didn't make the fight easier, but it did sway public opinion to a certain degree. So the 19th Amendment passes in 1920, and Crystal Eastman has an essay that she writes in the Liberator, and you can see it on the right of her picture. It says, "Now we can begin," which I believe is one of the finest essays about the women's movement that has ever been written. I am extraordinarily moved by it every time I read it. And she wrote, "Most women will agree that August 23rd, the day when the Tennessee legislature finally enacted the federal suffrage amendment, is a day to begin with, not to end with." Right? That this was not the culmination, that this was the beginning, which is why this is called Now We Can Begin. So now, she writes, women can say what they are really after. What they are after, in common with all the rest of the struggling world, is freedom. And so her understanding of freedom came out of the same understanding of freedom that we got from the Black leaders of the abolitionist movement, which was the equality of the soul, freedom in the eyes of God and freedom in the eyes of the law. And she articulates in this essay 4 ways through a feminist platform that women can be free. And I will tell you what they are. The first is freedom of choice in occupation and economic independence through equal pay. The second is a revolution in education, so that both men and women will be prepared to work both inside and outside the home. Funnily enough, she writes, it sounds so contemporary, but she says, men will not give up their privilege of helplessness without a struggle. 3, voluntary motherhood in terms of birth control. And 4, the motherhood endowment. And what she means by that is this, she says, "It seems that the only way we can keep mothers free, at least in a capitalist society, is by the establishment of a principle that the occupation of raising children is particularly and directly a service to society, and that the mother upon whom the necessity and privilege of performing this service naturally falls is entitled to an adequate economic reward from the political government. It is idle to talk of real economic independence for women unless this principle is accepted. But with a generous endowment of motherhood provided by legislation, with all laws against voluntary motherhood and education in its methods repealed, with the feminist ideal of education accepted in home and school, and with all special barriers removed in every field of human activity, there is no reason why a woman should not become almost a human thing. And so her point here is that because if women are choosing to have children, if that is a choice, voluntary motherhood, then that choice is their work. If they're not working outside the home because they're raising children, they are doing legitimate work and serving the nation, serving society. And women should be allowed that choice, whether or not they want to have children, and either choice is fine. But if they're going to choose children, then they should be compensated for that work so that they can remain financially independent, whether or not they have children. And so this is the idea of the motherhood endowment. And so again, if we have the motherhood endowment, we have voluntary motherhood, we have education that teaches both men and women how to work inside and outside the home, and freedom of choice in occupation, as well as equal pay, then perhaps, to her mind, there can be equality. I find it moving that we are still fighting for every single one of those things. Now, Eastman went on to write the next year about how much more work there was to do. Now, she writes another essay in The Liberator, and she's talking about Alice Paul. And she says, is Alice Paul a radical? She says, no. She called herself a radical. So Crystal Eastman believed that she herself was a radical and that Alice Paul was not, because Alice Paul did not see herself as class conscious, only as sex conscious. So she understood herself as a woman, but not as a member of a class. She really was not what we would now understand to be an intersectional feminist, and really was a white feminist, in a way a white supremacist. That she really was not moving the movement forward. So Crystal Eastman points out in 1921, until subjects like birth control and the rights of Negro women are part of the mainstream women's movement, American women cannot be congratulating ourselves that the feminist movement has begun in America. As it is, all we can say is that the suffrage movement is ended. So her point here is that unless the nation moves forward and opens this idea of freedom to all people, then it's simply the case that the 19th Amendment has passed, right? And not that the women's movement is taking that fight for freedom forward. So she knows this in 1921, and of course, millions of women across the nation knew it too, and took up the song and continued the fight, right? Particularly Black and queer women did so. One woman, who I think, interestingly enough, was born just about a month before the passage of the 19th Amendment in July of 1920, is Bella Abzug, who went on to become a member of the House of Representatives, right? And her point here is the woman's place is in the House and the House of Representatives. And she becomes a major proponent of the ERA, which, let's remember, was originally written in part by Crystal Eastman, so that's cool. She was also one of the first members of Congress to support gay rights. Now, so she's born 1920. Her address, she lived at 2 Fifth Avenue here in Greenwich Village. Born 1930 is Maureen Hensbury. Now, Maureen Hensbury attended the New School and moved to Greenwich Village in 1953. It was here that she wrote A Raisin in the Sun and became the first Black woman to write a play that was performed on Broadway. She also wrote for the Black newspaper Freedom and covered a great deal of the civil rights movement, of which she was an active part. Now, she met with Bobby Kennedy and JFK during the early 1960s to encourage their participation in the civil rights movement. And while she died of cancer in 1965 at the age of 34, she also had a strong hand in what would be the civil rights legislation of the 60s because of that kind of advocacy. She also inspired the Nina Simone song, Young, Gifted, and Black. And while it was not known during her lifetime, she actually is an LGBT pioneer. She identified as a lesbian, but it was not something that she was out about during her lifetime. But speaking of gay rights, oh, I'm sorry, this is her home. She lived at 112 Waverly. But speaking of gay rights, there is, of course, Marsha P. Johnson, who kicked off the Stonewall Riot and was a gay, trans, and queer pioneer. In 1971, we also have the arrest of Angela Davis. Angela Davis, I think when we think of her in Greenwich Village, we most closely associate her with the Women's House of Detention and her experience there in the early 1970s, but she actually came to the village before that. She was a student in high school at the Elizabeth Irwin Little Red Schoolhouse. And so actually this was a return to the village. And so Angela Davis remains a pioneer in the prison abolition movement, which I think is a beautiful coda. When we think about the women's movement coming out of the abolitionist movement, well, here we have another strain of abolition. We also have that very same year, in 1971, we have women artists of the Black arts movement coming together in Greenwich Village for the Where We At Black Women Arts Collective, which included Kay Brown, Faith Reingold, as well as Carol Blank and Jerry Cooks. This was formed in the spring of 1971 in the wake of an exhibition which took place at the Acts of Art Gallery here in Greenwich Village. And it was a rebuttal, it was a rebuttal to a show at the Whitney that took place that year that Black artists did not see themselves involved in. And so they got together in Greenwich Village and took this stand. Now, it is very clear that all of this advocacy and the advocacy that goes on to this day takes an extraordinary amount of courage. And when we read about it and we think about it, or at least for me, it gives me courage when I read about it and think about it. So I wanted to end with this, with Mother Courage, which was the first feminist restaurant, which was founded in 1972 by Dolores Alexander and Jill Ward, who were women's rights activists and also members of the LGBT community. Now, Mother Courage takes its name from a play by Bertolt Brecht, and, as I said, was the first feminist restaurant in the nation. So, as I say, I think we could all use a little bit of courage at this moment, and it's certainly these women and women like them who, in Greenwich Village and throughout the nation, lent their courage, their tenacity, their spirit, and their drive to a movement for change that continues to this day. So we celebrate them and we march on. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I am so happy to take questions, and I know there are some in the questions tab, so I'm going to head over there right now. I have the Henry Street settlement claims that the NAACP was founded in Lillian Wald's house, the headquarters of the settlement. Yes, I know, in her dining room. So that's interesting. So the first meeting of the NAACP in terms of like a steering committee, yes, meets there. But the first public meeting where the public could become involved, could attend, so on and so forth, took place at Cooper Union in 1909. But in terms of, the background of getting the organization off the ground, yes, that did first take place at Henry Street Settlement. Do you think it's a blatant failure of the feminist movement that not only has it not promoted, let alone achieved compensation for the most important work of humanity, which is the only work women can do and that men can't, but to add insult to injury, they promote abortion instead of helping women give birth, which is the will of 90% of kids. Well, okay. I think Crystal Eastman's point is choice, right? And so her point is, if you choose to give birth, there should be motherhood endowment. If you choose not to give birth, you should have full access to birth control, right? Her point was, when we read her essay, and it's a point that I wholeheartedly agree with, she makes the point, she makes the point that voluntary motherhood in the form of birth control is what's important. And she says, it is idle to talk of real economic independence for women unless this principle is accepted. Without a generous endowment for motherhood provided by legislation and all laws against voluntary motherhood and education in its methods repealed, right, that women can't be free. So again, there cannot be legislation against voluntary motherhood or obstruction of information about how to volunteer or not. So again, that's deeply a part of both the women's movement and the labor movement, and always has been. Surprised you didn't mention Margaret Sanger. Yes, of course. So Margaret Sanger was a villager, absolutely, and founded the very first birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn in 1916, and founded what became Planned Parenthood. She was an exceptional pioneer as well. At the turn of the century, were not some women very much active in the temperance movement, which at times created some friction? Completely, yeah. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, it's so interesting that we don't think of prohibition now as to have been a progressive idea, but it absolutely was at the time, because you had all these women who, remember when I was talking about the 1860 convention where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a lot of these other activists were fighting for legislation on changes in laws about marriage, which was that you would be allowed to divorce and things like this. Temperance really came out of that goal, which was the sense that because women in so many cases could not divorce, and if they did, it was so frowned upon, that they saw in many cases their husbands, certainly not only men, but in many cases their husbands, frittering away money on alcohol, becoming drunken, like beating their children, so on and so forth. And they thought, well, if we don't have this equality under the law, if we can't divorce, and we don't have access to our money, to our property, to our children, and in fact, we are the property of our husbands, our children are the property of our husbands, our money when we marry is the property of our husbands, we can't open our own bank accounts, right? This sense of these women being trapped and realizing, okay, maybe, if we get rid of alcohol, and so drunkenness is not a problem, perhaps that will improve the lives of women. So it is, interestingly, yes, became very much part of the women's movement, but also it has to be said that it became part of the women's movement because there was a nativist strain in America. that understood drunkenness to be a foreign concept, that it was coming from the Germans, that it was coming from the Irish, that it was coming in some way from overseas, which of course is nonsense. But it was this idea of an anti-immigrant sentiment that was also tied in with that. Can you speak to Alice Paul's position on segregating the Women's March on Washington, and to the fact that Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell objected, tried to reason with her, at least Terrell, and ultimately refused to comply with? Yes, absolutely. So that is true. So Alice Paul, and as I mentioned in the presentation, was actively looking to segregate that march, that she told Black activists that they could not march with their delegation. And certainly Ida B. Wells and also Mary Church Terrell objected to that and did in fact march with their delegations. But Alice Paul has become a very divisive figure for that reason, and she's such an interesting figure because she was so single-minded in a way that Susan B. Anthony became too. I see them as really parallel in different generations, that they both come out of this really progressive tradition. Susan B. Anthony coming out of the abolitionist movement, and Alice Paul herself being coming out of the settlement movement and so on and so forth, you know, but thinking like, the only thing that mattered to either of them was the passage of this amendment, and both of them took on a white supremacist mindset and really, really ran with it because they thought to themselves, and I'm lumping them together because in my mind they do this in a parallel way, which is to say, okay, well, if the nation, if everybody who opposes us, and men in particular, are also opposed to civil rights for Black people, then it will become harder for us white women, you know, who they understood to be women, right, to get this passed. And so what each of them did was say, okay, we are going to throw Black women under the bus, right? We are going to deny Black women their essential humanity for our own favor, which is to say, okay, well, if we don't allow Black women to march with us, if we make this a white movement, it will, to their minds, become more palatable to the nation at large. And that is a morally bankrupt bargain, right? It's disgusting, and we understand it to be disgusting today. But that's really the way that they thought about it. And to the everlasting credit of tenacious Black women, they just didn't comply. They just didn't comply. Thank you all so much. Can I answer anything else?
Everyone just wants to try their
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you everyone for attending. We'll have the video up probably tomorrow and follow up with all of you. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to that email tomorrow. Have a good day. Anything else, Lucy?
No, that's it. Thank you all so much. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.